I chatted with Nadhim Zahawhi, the Vaccines Minister. And what I pointed out to him is that the key piece of data when it comes to deciding whether to open up on the 21st of June is how many of us will have had 2 vaccine doses by the 7th of June, because only 2 doses gives really significantly strong protection, and it takes 2 weeks for that protection to kick in fully. This is what he said to me.
So I think you're right. If you remember the 4 tests, 1 is vaccination at scale, 2, that vaccine efficacy continues, that they're working, 3 is infection rates, and 4 is variants. We're at 75% of all adults in the UK now have had 1 dose.
But we know that the first dose does not give,
Correct.
More than about 30% protection against the virus.
Absolutely right. And we're at 49.5% of all adults with 2 doses. We're hoping to offer the second dose to all cohorts 1 to 9, the over 50s, if you recall, who've had their first dose, their second dose before the 21st of June.
How much before the 21st of June do you think all of 1 to 9 will have been vaccinated?
Well, again, we're running the numbers to see it.
Because if it was a couple of weeks before, I think people would say, right, that gives a lot of comfort.
We're working at speed and scale, and I'm confident that we will offer it before the 21st of June. But
that's not, as I say, some would say that's not quite soon enough.
And I think this is where we have to be cautious. I think you're absolutely right to say that we have to watch what the virus is doing, because I think the really important thing to remember is, and let's sort of do a little bit of a sort of arithmetic exercise here. If you have 85% of all adults vaccinated with 2 doses, and you have 85% efficacy, that's only 72% protection.
Frankly, it is very tight. You just don't know at the moment whether we're going to be sort of safe enough by June the 14th, which is when the decision has to be taken.
Well, as I said, at the moment, there's nothing in the data to suggest that we need to move the roadmap. But
you may have to move the roadmap.
And we've been straight with people, as both the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Health has said, is that on the 14th of June we will share with the nation all the data that we would have gathered. So today's the 2nd of June. The next 12 days are going to be really important to see what the virus is doing. We've got a very large-scale sort of surveillance infrastructure in place, both in terms of wastewater surveillance and, of course, large-scale.
So can I ask you about surveillance? Because
testing.
we've had, it's largely anecdotal at the moment, but we've had reports from universities of university students getting the virus for a second time in reasonably significant numbers. I mean, that must be a concern. Of
course, and you can. I said it a few days ago. A member of my family has 2 doses of Pfizer. They are over 80. They got the virus, but they were protected. They didn't need to go to hospital.
Oh, OK.
They were fine.
But that was encouraging.
They recovered. That is encouraging.
But they still got the virus.
Absolutely.
Though.
Another member of my family had a single dose of AstraZeneca, also had it mild, younger, but very mild infection. So the vaccines work. The really important question is the relationship between infection rates and then serious illness and hospitalisation, and sadly, death in some cases.
Now, I'm going to ask you to break the habits of a lifetime and not give a government answer, but a personal answer, because it is a tricky question, this. But what's your personal view about whether we should be moving relatively soon to vaccinate children if it's safe?
So I've learnt one, when you are a government minister,
you're not allowed to have
no such thing as a personal view, Robert, and well done for trying.
But it's not so much that, it's just that your experts on the JCVI say that this is going to end up being an ethical decision, not a scientific decision.
Well, on children, what's really important is some children obviously do get serious COVID and long COVID, but on the whole, you would be vaccinating to protect their families, the community, and
what do you think the ethics of that are?
So it needs to be unbelievably safe for children to be vaccinated, which is why the MHRA, our regulator, independent regulator, has to approve the vaccine. The Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, JCVI, have to then give us their advice, and then we'll look at that. It's interesting that I think...
Sounds to me as though you are going to authorise children being vaccinated.
If you look at what's happening in other countries, I see tonight President Macron is authorising the vaccination programme for 12 to 18-year-olds in France.
So we're going to do this.
But I think, look, ultimately we will look at the information from the JCVI and their advice, Up until now, we have led the world in terms of our strategy. If you recall, when we began vaccinating back on the 8th of December, people criticised or questioned our strategy to deliver one dose and 12 weeks before the second dose, about the prioritisation list of 1 to 9, with residents of care homes being number 1, and then over 80s, and of course 9 being the over 50s. But up until now, I think the JCVI have been absolutely spot on this, and I think it's right that we ask them to give us guidance on whether or not to start vaccinating 12 to 15-year-olds, because, of course, the Pfizer vaccine is available to 16 and above. But we'll wait for both the regulator and the JCVI.
Now, I know it's not your sort of area of expertise, as it were, but you are a member of the government, and probably the biggest story tonight is that Sir Kevin Collins, who's been advising the Prime Minister on how children can catch up with their education after the devastation of COVID. He's resigned, and he has said, part of his statement is, that all that catch-up by disadvantaged children over the last 10 years has probably been reversed, and he says what the government has announced in terms of help is too slow and too little. What happened to levelling up?
So I know Kevin Collins well, because I was in the Department of Education before as Children and Families Minister, and I thank him for all the work he's done. You've got to remember a couple of things. One, in his resignation letter, and the letter he's written to the Prime Minister, he talks about how important the 1.4 billion that's been announced today, which takes the catching up fund to about 3 billion.
It's nowhere near enough.
Hold on, I hear you, and I'm going to get to this point. He talks about why it's important, because he follows the evidence, because he did so much work on the Educational Endowment Foundation, and that is tutoring and then quality of teaching, and the 1.4 billion absolutely targets both those things. And then we've said we will, of course, look at the most important part of his advice, which is lengthening the day, the time that
school day
that children get to have in education. And we said we look at that and we'll review it in time for the spending review. So all these things are things that are absolutely well worth us making sure that we look at and look at carefully. We thank him for everything he's done. I think you've got to also remember, we started from a very high point.
But you started with a position of saying that you respect him, and he's saying you're not doing enough.
Well, I was going to finish by saying to you, Boris Johnson started from a very high point, because if you recall, in 2019, the settlement for education was 14 billion, biggest probably in a generation, over 3 years. And on top of it is the 3 billion.
But he estimates the cost to all of us from this educational disaster as 100 billion plus. And he's saying more or less whatever you spend, you'll get your money back. And why aren't you spending it?
So the recommendation, the biggest part of his recommendation is lengthening the school day.
Is that going to happen? Is that going to happen?
Well, that's going to be reviewed. That requires, the teaching unions to agree to it. It requires us to review it, and of course, spending review and making sure that we.
So it's Rishi Sunak's fault, is what?
No, it's not. We've got to review and see whether, at the moment, the same people who are attacking us, saying why didn't you go that far, are the teaching unions who resisted, the idea of extending the school day in the first place. I'd like to see them. I'd like to see the Labour Party say, actually, you know what, that is the right thing to do. We will support it. Then we'll review it, and of course, it will be reviewed in time for the spending review.
OK, I don't think anybody would have heard that and thought that you were signing up to his agenda. But listen, there's time. Lovely to see you, as always.
Great to see you.